2018, a video filmed at Southlake High School in northern Texas went viral. In it, several teenagers from the affluent, mostly white suburban town were chanting the N-word. NBC News correspondent Antonia Hylton and national investigative reporter Hixenbaugh rightly surmised that there is a lot more to this story. Their podcast, Southlake, has been breaking listenership records since it was launched in late August. Antonia and Mike join us today to share their experiences, diving deeper into the culture wars taking place in Southlake and also across much of America. Mike and Antonia, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
And Antonia, I want to thank you, especially you're coming to us from the back of a rental car.
Yes, I am. Sorry, I don't have the most beautiful background, but I'm in the field right now in Tennessee covering a breaking COVID story. And, this is the life of a reporter for NBC News. So thank you for having me.
Thank you guys for joining us. And boy, that shows commitment. So Antonia, I want to start with this viral video from 2018. Tell me what was in it. What made you want to revisit Southlake for this podcast?
Well, this 2018 video is now in Southlake really the stuff of lore. And, what you see in it is a group of teenagers, white teenagers who've been hanging out together after a homecoming dance, chanting the N-word. But when it went viral at the time in 2018, people in the community came together across, all sides of the political spectrum. And they're saying that racism is real and they want to address it. And then this community council comes together, a diversity council, and they start to work on what is effectively a diversity and equity plan for the school district, with the belief that the school district is the right place to educate students about these issues, to address them, to hold students who, take part in videos like this one accountable. And so that work begins in 2018, but that plan isn't ready until 2020. And it comes out in the months after George Floyd's murder. And now we are all living in a new political and racial context. And so community members who either hadn't been paying attention or in some cases had even been supportive of this plan start to see diversity and equity work in a completely different light. And in those moments where the two of us end up teaming up together and first reporting on this, I don't know that we recognized how big this story was or how much the dynamics in Southlake, this fight that became a fight over critical race theory, was going to spread all over the country. At first, it seemed to us like this fascinating political story with really great characters and interviewees whose stories deserve to be told. But as we took on this journey and eventually pitched and worked on this podcast, it became bigger than either of us could have ever imagined.
What is your background? And was it hard to report because of your race?
So my background is that I'm Black, and I grew up in a community not that unlike Southlake. I open up in a USA Today piece that we wrote, introducing the Southlake series about an experience that I had around graduation time where classmates of mine, after 4 years of me being in classes with them and working really hard, all seemed quite upset that I got into the colleges that I got into, and that ended up really souring my experience. And so what was tough for me at times was I would sit down with kids who talked about the kind of taunts and harassment that they experienced in school, the way they believed their classmates or their teachers in some cases saw them. And I felt like I was being transported back in time. And I graduated from high school more than a decade ago. But it was interesting to me just how much, I guess you find that those wounds haven't healed. That I'm listening to a teenager talk to me about how much pain, how lonely they are. And then I remember just how lonely I felt. I think ultimately, my background, though, was a strength and working, Mike and I coming from such different perspectives, I think made this podcast so much stronger. And that the empathy that we had for each other and our, very different lives made us better interviewers. It made us more patient interviewers. I think it made us more thorough reporters and made the series really strong. And so I would say the hardest part was just I left some of these conversations so sad that things that I went through 10 years ago were just still happening every day.
Mike, what was the most shocking thing that you uncovered in your reporting of this town and the school district?
That question actually makes me think about the first conversation that Antonia and I had. I'd been working on a written story about the diversity plan and the blowback to it in Southlake. And I got teamed up with Antonia to make so she can make a TV piece. And I remember telling her on that call, I cannot believe some of the things that Black students have had said to them in this school district. And you'll hear in the podcast, like comments like, a fifth grader joking to a classmate, a white fifth grader joking to his classmate saying,
"Hey, Frankie, how do you get a black out of a tree? You cut the rope."
These kind of just like horrifying, comments out of the mouth of children. And I told Antonia, it's just shocking to me. And this will show you the dynamic that we both brought to the table here in this podcast, because her reaction to my comment was, "That's really not that surprising, Mike. Me being a white guy who grew up mostly around white people, I didn't hear these kind of comments directed at Black people because there were no Black people in my lives." Mm-hmm. But what was really, I think, what drew me to the story was contrasting those comments and those experiences and those testimonies with how the community reacted to the plan to address it. And so what you saw is in a preview of what was to come across the country this past year, this kind of conservative grassroots uprising in town to try to stop the diversity plan. And so we wanted to explore that. What was driving this? What was driving this backlash?
Antonia, for the podcast, you talked to a lot of parents in the community. What were some of their revelations?
Well, depending on which parents you spoke to, conversations would go in a completely different direction. So, one of the parents we really focus on, whose life story ends up becoming, somewhat of a spine to the series, is a woman named Robin Cornish. And this is a Black mother of 5 students who came through this school district. Her family moved out there in the 90s when Southlake was, she describes it as a series of dirt roads. There really wasn't much to the town yet. And, she immediately realizes that, they're mostly surrounded by white people, that there's not going to be too many friends of theirs who look like them. But there's a lot of optimism in those early days in the 90s. And she talks to me and Mike about this experience or sort of awakening that she has over time as her kids start to come home from school crying, telling her about the comments that they've heard, telling her about the lack of action in some cases that teachers or administrators who were present did or failed to take. And she starts to realize there's something lurking there underneath the surface, and she calls it Southlake's dirty secret. And what we found is when we spoke to other families of color, even some who didn't know Robin Cornish particularly well, they all kind of talked about the same patterns of behavior. Their children being told horribly racist things at school, being made fun of. Another family that we spoke to in town talked about their daughter in kindergarten being told by classmates, well, we can't play with you on the playground because your skin is Black. And then when the parents drive to the school and they try to get an administrator to take action, they feel like they're left in the dark. Either it's unclear what action is taken in many cases because the district says they can't comment on what they're doing, or there's some resistance and a sense that these Black parents have gotten that the school district wants to protect these kids from any kind of accountability, and that they really want to preserve an image of the district as being one that is, positive, full of excellence. And this idea that there's racial tension in the town is one that they feel many leaders there in the school district and outside of the school district seem really resistant to acknowledging. And this is well before the 2018 video even comes out.
Why do you think this podcast is resonating so well across the country?
Well, I think that a lot of people can see themselves in this story. These kinds of issues were bubbling up in suburban communities across the country, communities that used to be mostly white, that have grown more diverse. And then you take all of the turmoil and pain of 2020 with George Floyd and the election, and what you had in Southlake was happening in suburbs and towns across the country. What we found an interesting dynamic throughout all of this is, I think although lots of students have made dumb comments and hurt their classmates' feelings, and have made just, have bullied classmates, a lot of times the students are having more civil conversations about these matters than the grown-ups. And there's a couple key moments in the podcast, and I really hope people give it a listen. When you hear audio recording made by students after, in one example, a Black high school senior at Carroll, the high school, had overheard a kid using the N-word, a white student using the N-word in class. He was making an argument about why, if rappers can say the N-word, white people should be able to say it without getting punished. And she reported him to the principal. The principal called them down to his office. This is in the midst of this community grappling with this issue. And she hit record on her cell phone. And in the podcast, you can hear just ripping 10 minutes of audio of this exchange between the principal and this white student and the black student, as she's trying to explain why this hurts, why I don't want to hear my white classmates say this word. And the white student responding, it's just a word. There are no words that offend me. And the black student becomes very emotional. And what you also hear in this audio is how the principal, a white man who's overseeing this district, how he responds. And it's really revealing.
Antonia, we did a podcast here on the Recount Daily Pod that did incredibly well on critical race theory. Explain to us, how do you define it? Why was this such a big issue in Southlake?
Well, the first question you asked there alone is like, people could lecture on this for an entire semester. And I think that that's important to acknowledge how academic and high level this conversation is, because the reality is that districts at a K through 12 level are not equipped and are not really engaging in critical race theory. And in the podcast, in one of the episodes, we sit down with Kimberly Crenshaw, who's one of the founders of the original scholarly founders of critical race theory. And this is something that was developed by Black and Latino scholars going back to the 70s and 80s. And it is a high-level framework for looking at how laws, Supreme Court decisions, and policies contribute to inequality, racially related inequities and outcomes. And it's a format that is constantly evolving. It's not something that can be boiled down into a student handbook, an easy how to do it or how to avoid it. And so, what Kimberly Crenshaw reflects on in our interview is what it has been like for her to see decades of her academic work be dragged into the political sphere, for the language of her work to be applied to issues that really have nothing to do with what this framework was designed to give scholars the opportunity to study and to discuss among each other. And what you find right now, as this fight spreads all over the country, is that people are using the phrase critical race theory to describe history lessons that make white children uncomfortable. Just recently there was a report about parents pushing back against a book that dealt with Martin Luther King's life, amounting that to critical race theory. These are facts. They may have elements of the story that make or may not make some students uncomfortable, but applying the phrase critical race theory to these elements, these materials in school, it's really alarming to someone like Kimberly Crenshaw, because it's not representative of the work that she's done for decades. And her fear that she spells out in the podcast is that this phrase is being used for what she calls, grand lying for political purposes, that it's become, really a branding technique that doesn't have much to do with the reality of what critical race theory was meant to be. And I think that's now what she describes it as, like a runaway train, and it's off the tracks, and a lot of people don't know where it's going.
Antonia, what do you hope people take away from the Southlake story and from your podcast?
It's the voices of kids, and it's the sort of persistent optimism among some of the children in the district that I was so struck by. And then, you contrast these adults who have all this anger and emotion in this fight over, perceived threats to their school system, perceived threats to their majority white students in this district. And then you contrast that with the actual testimony of children who desperately want to be heard. And in this entire national fight over critical race theory, somehow their voices have been drowned out. Whether it's on the political stage as politicians go back and forth about it, or it's been in some of the national coverage. I mean, it's often parents and administrators who are centered in these stories. But Mike and I were so intentional about making sure that children are at the forefront of all of this, because there are kids going to school every day having these experiences, hearing and experiencing traumatic incidents, who are asking for adults to listen to them, to believe them, and to maybe help them or do something about it. Because when you outlaw, how we can talk about racism in the classroom, or you do or you do not take action to address racist incidents in your school or anti-gay, anti-LGBTQ incidents in your school, there are children who are leaving these school systems year after year affected by what they've seen and heard for years to come. And if you don't listen to them now, you don't know what kind of school system you are leaving behind for generations.
The podcast is called Southlake. Antonia Hylton and Mike Hixenbaugh. I want to thank you both for joining us.
Thank you for having us.